Welcome to another draft physics presentation. Ken Wheeler video, but it's just mostly going to be an explanation of what magnetism really is, as opposed to Ken's gibberish. So I will attempt to explain certainly what I know to be a fact, what conventional physics has done experiments proving, in a sense, establishing well beyond reasonable objection, let's say, and the inconsistencies between these things and what Ken Wheeler claims to be reality, which is, again, just mostly made up of jargon speak. There's no, clearly he's saying things in that jargon that have implications as mechanisms, and they don't exist, and he's deceiving people and misleading people and very poorly describing something fundamental in terms of a science, and just doing really bad science, period. That's the simple truth. So let's play this gibberish. Secrets of magnetism. He has none of the secrets. He has no understanding of the fundamental mechanism at all.
Okay. This is something that everybody believes exists and doesn't exist. Secrets of magnetism. This existed since the days of Faraday, when they were sprinkling iron filings on pieces of paper. I assume you've heard...
Alright, so the first thing to understand is that basic experiment and how it has fundamental limitations as a method of doing the science. So you can sort of understand, if I have a medium between the magnet and the iron filings, the iron filings aren't going to do what they would do if the medium wasn't there, if the paper wasn't there. They're being restricted from doing what they would do. They're being stopped. And so they're revealing the process. They're not revealing what a magnet causes to happen. They're revealing a stage in that event. A place where magnets will go through, but they will transition through that event. So if you put a plain magnet in magnetic fluid, it'll just attract all the ferromagnetic material, and there will be no field lines. There'll be no representation of the voyage the magnets took, the little magnetic material. I don't think I need a drawing yet, so you can just understand that the idea of field lines is not a scientific idea. So because people talked about these lines of force, doesn't mean they're talking about them the way Ken Wheeler is implying they're talking about them. Modern physics has understood that those lines are arbitrary, that they don't exist as real things, that nothing will line up with them and stay there. They can only make them into that pattern by restricting their movement, stopping them from going where they want to go, where they are compelled by physics to go.
Of lines of force. Magnetic lines of force.
So this part, I guess I might as well start drawing to explain the difference and how the term lines of force is used in different ways. So the real circumstance, so let's say this is a magnet, and just imagine plus and minus, south and north. So we have this idea. These things here are called lines of force. Okay, and what's happening when the iron filings do this, what you need to understand is the little bits of material, especially when it comes to like ferrofluid, the little bits of material are lining up with each other as little magnets. So that is, the north side is connecting to the south side is connecting to the north side. They're all staggered. Staggered meaning, try to draw it bigger and then you'll see what I'm saying. So they're all lined up north-south, north-south, north-south. So their opposite ends are attracted. And then the magnets next to them line up north-south, north-south, staggered. So they're connected north-south, north-south. So it's all attractive, and the end result is these little magnets become one big magnet when you add them up. Essentially, all the north sides are pointing in one direction. I mean, I'm doing this in one color just because it's simpler, but you get the idea. All the norths are at one end, all the souths are at the other end. So they're all facing this way. And that's exactly opposite to the magnet, of course. That's how they are attracted. So if the little bit is this way, it'll flip, okay, to be attractive. And so it's going to have the north-south is going to be south-north for the little magnets. So essentially all these little magnets are creating new magnets in the shape of these lines. So these lines essentially are a new magnet, and each line is a new magnet of the same opposite polarization to this one. So they're all being attracted to the very powerful magnetic field. They're all end up being OX's, and therefore each one of these is repelling each other because they're all O. So all of these lines are repelling each other as they're being attracted to the big magnet, the strong magnetic field. That's why there's distance between them. That's the only reason why there's distance. And the smaller you can make these little bits of magnetism, the closer together or further apart these lines will be. These lines aren't a set force line. So what needs to be understood is, so when they say lines of force, they can also represent the power of a magnet. So think of the magnet as being two light bulbs. So this is red light comes out of the top and blue light comes out of the bottom. And that's what magnets are doing, is they're radiating, just like a light bulb, force. And the two forces, conventional physics doesn't do this part because they haven't figured out polarization. So just imagine from their perspective, these are all the same force, but somehow there's some that they're acknowledging it has a different character because it has a different effect. Obviously the magnets react to it. And as I've explained in many videos, why when you reverse it, it's a reflective force, and then it creates less pressure, but I won't go into those arguments in this video. Well, I might later. But the point is to understand it radiates just like a light bulb. And so what you're really doing is measuring the intensity of the light. And this, like gravity and a light bulb, it obeys the inverse square law. So as the distance increases, the force decreases. And it does so at 4 times the rate as you increase the distance. And this is a same principle that's involved again in just about all of the forces behave this way. So by Maxwell's equations, by all the mathematics that works, this is what they're describing, is a force. And the force has an effect at a specific distance by this inverse square law. So the force at the surface, if you go, as you increase the distance from the surface, there's a reduction in the amount of the force. And it's by the same principles as the inverse square law, which essentially can be illustrated probably most precisely by just recognizing this simple principle, that 1 square, okay, at a distance equals 4 squares. So twice the distance, 4 times as much area. That means the force is diluted. So you can sort of understand that if light's coming off of something and there's a certain quantity of the light, that as you go further and further away, the percentage of the field that you are, right? Say my hand is obeying the inverse square law. Okay, I cut the distance in half. My hand is 4 times smaller. So half the distance, 4 times smaller. So it's consuming 4 times less frame of this image. Here to here. So you can sort of see it. 1/4 of the box now has hand in it. Here, the whole box is hand. Here, 1/4 of the box is hand. So it's just like light. Most of the light is missing me now. Where here, all the light was hitting the hand. Now only 1/4 of the light hits the hand. And as you keep doing this, it keeps degrading at that rate. Now this stuff is experimentally proven over and over and over and over again. This is established fact. And this is what the force is. So this line is kind of arbitrary. You could draw lines and say at each one of these lines, I go twice the distance. I know I got 1/4 the force I had here. And I have 1/4 the force I had here. So it always drops by this 1/4 if I'm having the distance. So you can sort of understand that the same thing would happen with a light bulb. It's less and less surface area. The further away I go, the less light, the less of the photons will hit me. And magnets work the same way. So there's no set lines of force except the rays of force. Just like you can think about how the sun has rays of light. And a light bulb is emitting rays of light. Magnets are emitting rays of force. And they're doing the same exact thing as a ray would do, which is you can understand that the rays diverge. So you can understand that over distance, you could be a person here and no rays would be hitting you because they've diverged and missed you. So the closer you are, the more likely you are to get hit by rays. The further you are, the less likely you are. And that's the simple principle. But there's no lines of force. There's none of this. There's just algebraic and geometric ways of measuring the intensity of the force. And yes, there's a way of revealing where magnets will be stuck if you create a barrier between the magnet and the little iron filings. If you create a barrier that stops the iron filings from falling into the magnet, being attracted, then they'll be suspended in locations, and because they do create magnets that are repulsive to each other, lines that are repulsive, they will have distance between them. And that's just going to happen. So the more little iron filings that line up, the wider this distance gets. So the distance is proportional to the amount of magnetism. And you can sort of see this with ferrofluid when it creates the rather famous little pyramids. You probably might have seen some of that if you've watched any videos of ferrofluid. You'll get these little mounds, and it's like the little mound has a string that would be coming out of it, and that would be a field line. But it's completely arbitrary, essentially. It's not arbitrary, it's not for no reason, but these lines aren't set lines. They aren't specific lines actually coming out of the magnet. They're just a representation again of what happens when each one of these little pyramids, so when the ferrofluid piles up, gravity is pushing it down, and so it's making this part thick. And so this part is more magnetic because it's thicker, and that means it's repelling the other piles of magnets, the other little magnets. And so they're repelling each other, and so they're all hunting for a peaceful place, and the peaceful place would be right on this line, the place where they're perfectly lined up with the magnet, perfectly lined up with the the force. So these peaks always happen on the north end or the south end of the magnet. So they're happening on the top of the magnet. So this would be the straight line force coming out of the top. And they're just a representation of the fact that these magnets will all be repelling each other, these lines, these strings of magnet, and that gravity is pushing it down. And so it can't seek to fill this straight line because gravity pushes it down. Simple kind of explanation. So in the ferrocell, when you see these swirly patterns, the swirly stuff coming in, you can also notice the same effect in that the outside lines are thick and the inside lines are thin. And so you have to recognize that creates more white space between them. The more little filings there are, the stronger the magnet, and therefore the more repulsion you get between them. So the thinner the amount of the less dense the ferrofluid is in terms of the little the ferromagnetic pieces, the less density, then the less ability to form a magnet, the less repulsion between them, and the closer and finer the lines get. And clearly that happens right near the poles of the magnet where all the fluid is, and it goes black. So you'll see that in Ken's videos where the poles are. It's a little black spot. Well, it's black because all the ferro material is going there. And near there, there's very little material. So the lines are thin. And further away, there's more material, so the lines get fatter. Alright, I think that's enough. We'll let it play a little bit. So that's the real context. It's a radiant force, like a light bulb. There are no real lines of anything, and certainly nothing moving, swirling, or doing anything like that. Nothing's coming out of one end and going in the other end. All of that is not happening. There's no physics, real physics for anything like that. This is Maxwell. These rays of force. That's Maxwell. That's the mathematics that works. Understanding this divergence. That's what the math is consistent with. Inverse square law. There's no field lines. There's lines or rays of force. Okay. Continuing.
They're lines? Really? Fields don't have lines. Well, you can feel it if you actually stick on your headphones and you wave an electromagnet over top of a magnetic field. You'll hear scratching lines. You'll hear lines, like fibrous lines.
Yeah, it's not true. What you hear is the domains in the metal flipping. There's like the ferrofluid. The ferrofluid is shaped, by the way. I mean, there's a guy who had looked under a microscope at this stuff. They're little bits, little longer than they are wide, and they don't stick to each other. So they're very much like little magnets, except they can't perfectly stick because they've been coated with soap and they're in oil. So they can freely move once the magnetism stops. Once they stop being magnetic, like the iron filings. So they're free agents, except when they're magnetic, then they stick to each other as close as they can. So they're just like a bunch of grass seeds, or however you want to look at it, and they line up like grass seeds would. Yeah, they actually use grass seeds because they are magnetic to see the field lines of, say, charge. They're the same kind of lines. They're not real lines. They're lines created by the effect of effectively magnetizing objects.
Also, too, if you... Here's one example in a test tube I did. You can actually see these spikes.
Yeah, I can actually see nothing. So incredibly useless as an example.
But the spikes have dips. You know what this looks like? This looks exactly like the double slit experiment where you actually get...
So here we do it again. So anytime there's an on-off pattern anywhere, on, off, anything separated by distance, everybody just pulls out this word interference as if that's the only way on-off can be created. And as I just pointed out, I can create on-off with a series of magnets. If I put all the magnets with their polarity the same, all their north sides pointing up, I can't push them together. And if they were dominoes, they would look like an interference pattern because they'd all just line up a specific distance from each other. And if I tried to push them together from the outside, they'll all have the same distance from each other. There's nothing interfering. There's clearly the repulsive force of the magnet. No interference required. The stronger the magnet, the further apart they are. The weaker the magnet, the closer they are. Nothing, no interference. It's a silly word to introduce into magnetism. There's no evidence of any interferences taking place in the fundamental mechanism of a magnet.
Interference, constructive and destructive interference. Here's a...
So just a complete... There's no evidence of that. He certainly has no proof of it. And I'd say the established physics is pretty hard in demonstrating that the reason why there's distance between the field lines is because the magnets are lined up face to face, north to north, south to south. They can't be pushed together. That's why it's there. There's no destructive or constructive interference at all. It's a complete category error to introduce this word.
Where the lines of force actually originated from, and of course anybody could sprinkle iron filings over top of a magnet. You'll see these lines. Well, that's magnetic lines of force.
See, he does this cliche paraphrasing of physics, and like it's the Flintstones or something, and he does this really, poor drawing of what they're saying, making no effort to be really accurate about what they're saying. And again, the lines of force are really the radians of force coming off at straight line vectors. He's used the word vectors. He's pointed out that Maxwell's equation is nothing but vectors. And it's exactly the truth. That's the force. The force is a vector.
You can also see the lines in a hypertrochoidal pattern. Hypertrochoid, kind of like a spirograph. Here's
Yeah, so again, this has, nothing to do with magnetism in the sense that magnets don't have any moving parts. Once they're in position, they're in a position, and now they're just a filter, like a piece of filter paper, like a filtered piece of glass, the color, that takes out a certain color of light. There's no moving parts. It's just a filter. Magnets segregate force.
Ferrocell hold over top of a magnet. Here you can see the interlacing clock.
So again, this useless, let me show you on my iPad, it's just far from adequate.
Counterclockwise, constructive, destructive interference.
So again, this clockwise, counterclockwise, there's no evidence of anything moving at all. Never been detected anything called a movement. So again, he's saying this thing is doing a clockwise thing. There's no evidence that anything's moving in any direction.
Of a magnet over top of a supercell.
So again, I think I'll make a video titled Debunking the ferrocell. And so if you I've done some research. I haven't found any site that analyzes how exactly ferrocells work. I clearly just pointed out one part where the thickness of where the light's going through, where you see the light, is dependent on the strength of the ferrous material, how much of it is collected. And that the light is really being refracted because the little bits don't stick to each other perfectly, and there's lots of light refraction going through small aperture refraction, which is causing internal reflections in the thin layer of oil between the two pieces of glass. So the thin layer of oil is reflecting internally the light, and that's why it's coming out at all these bizarre angles, and that's why the image changes depending on what angle you look at it. Anyway, that's a brief description. It's not an accurate representation of reality. It's an optical illusion. It's not giving you a very representative picture of reality.
Here you can see the same thing. Either one of these is...
So if you have any links or anything like that that might be helpful, if you can find anything that debunks the ferrocell, explains how it works, I'll put up a video that for that basic purpose, I guess, and I'll put the links in the description, just because there should be some resource that gives people enough understanding so they don't be fooled by the little pretty images that have nothing to do with reality.
The pole of a magnet, by the way. You can see the same lines. Why? Those are...
So again, they're not lines of force. Physics isn't arguing those are lines of force. And again, they're just a representation. Again, these are little bits of ferrous material in a liquid medium between two pieces of glass. They're suspended. They don't have free liberty to move anywhere they want. They're restricted, and they're restricted by each other and previous alignments of the material in the ferrocell and the density of the material. So there's lots of limitations to where they can move. It's not like throwing iron filings on a plain piece of paper where there's no restriction. So imagine the iron filings are trapped between two pieces of paper, and so they can't jump over each other. They have to sort of smash into each other to get anywhere. It's a lot more complicated, and it's just wrong to use this interesting but not very scientific instrument. It's not a very good ruler for measuring. It's a wacky ruler. It's like the funhouse mirrors. It'll give you an image, but it's not an image of reality. And the image might be entertaining, but again, it's not reality.
Lines of force. That has to be what that is. Well, there are no lines of force.
So he says this, but he just blamed it on interference a minute ago, right? So he believes there's some sort of lines. He thinks they're being caused by destructive and constructive interference. So again, just like he says there's no photon and there's no energy and there's no this and there's no that, he doesn't believe there's no force. He just doesn't want to call it a force, and that's about all. It's just semantics. He believes there's lines, so he's just playing word games.
Torus that makes up the field around a coherent magnet. It's actually a conjugate magnetodielectric field.
Yes, conjugate magnetodielectric field. Jargon. There's just nothing to play with there. How do you make any of that crap make sense? It's word vomit.
Of the torus representing magnetism, force and motion, and the hyperboloid representing inertia and acceleration of the dielectric. You have this conjugate interplay, or yin and yang, if you will.
So there's no yin and yang beside the point that the electron and the proton are opposite filters, poles of the magnetism, essentially. They are the monopoles of magnetism. And the magnet's just a reflection of charge. And we have plus and minus. So we do have a yin and a yang, if you want to call them that. We have opposites that have performance rules. And that in the one configuration they'll stick to each other, another configuration they'll repel each other.
I'm going to actually read from part of my lecture.
All right, this is just amazing. Again, if anybody can suffer through his lecture, it should be like an endurance contest. Like trying to drink, 600 cups of, I don't know, easy bake oven soup. I don't know.
So from the 4th edition of my book. So I assume it's okay to read this since I wrote it to begin with.
I mean, no one else could write it, that's for certain. I mean, I just can't imagine anybody writing such a pile of gobbledygook.
There are no magnetic lines of force. They are not.
So again, they exist. There's a they here. So he's just saying you can't call them lines of force. You can't call it the balance that's created. But again, the real force is the rays. And he's not even coming close to getting that one right.
Not lines. These so-called lines of force pertaining to magnetism is a gross, perceptually based error and absurdity. It has absolutely no reality whatsoever.
So you wrote that mush. I don't think you wrote that part.
Said lines are only the peaks and troughs of the conjugate magnetodielectric system, which...
All right, peaks and troughs. So again, talking as if there's some sort of interference, and there's no such interference. There's no mechanism here. No description of a mechanism, nothing. No picture of the mechanism, no illustration of the mechanism, nothing. Just gobbledygook.
Are mutually both manifest and anti-manifest.
All right, I mean, like that is just the most, they are, but they are not. It's black, but it's white. It's on, but it's off. I mean, who with a seriously a reasoning brain can accept that on Ken's word for it? Oh, I'll take your word for it. The on is partially off. I'll take Ken's word for it. He's fat but incredibly thin.
Space and counter space, as they interplay against each other towards both the creation of space as meant, i.e. magnetism.
I.e. space is magnetism now. I mean, again, how can this mean anything to a rational person who's ever read any physics books at all? Even taken earth science in grammar school, this is just got to be impossible to fit with common scientific limitations on jargon.
Because that's what magnetism does. And counter space, in the case of the...
Whatever, the counter space again. The nothing something. The something that isn't nothing. I don't know.
Hyperboloid, or the hourglass shape, i.e. the secondary...
I.e. again, the hyperboloid, the hourglass, the tornado, the... whatever, on and on and on. There's no evidence of any of those things existing. The evidence is the force radiates like a light bulb. There's no toruses or hyperboloids on a light bulb. Nobody imagines the light bulb shoots rays out this way and they go back into the light bulb at the bottom and there's all kinds of stuff going on. No, there's rays of force. That's how you create the inverse square law, is you have two lines that diverge. That's how you create the inverse square law. No evidence of hyperboloids or toroids.
Conjugate, or really the primary conjugate.
Certainly no conjugate, primary conjugate, secondary conjugate, fullendary conjugate, up conjugate, down conjugate, blah, 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 blah.
Magnetodielectric.
Magnetodielectric, what does that mean? It's run by an engine. That's a magneto, a spinning magnet. The magnetism is run by a spinning magnet. Oh, spinning magnets make magnetism. That's an explanation of magnetism. That's a secret of magnetism, is that magnets make magnetism. Little magnets make big magnets. Little magno-magnets. Magneto magnets.
Geometry that makes up the magnet.
Clearly, it's all about atomic geometry.
This is simplex constructive.
Nothing simplex. So he's saying it's simple, constructive, and destructive interference. Never a simple subject. Not in any other force is it ever a simple subject. Nobody grapples with it rationally. They have all kinds of wacky theories where this interference thing requires the creation of multiverses. It requires photons to have radar. There's even speculation that the photons can read our minds because of this interference phenomenon. So how is it simple? It's clearly, by their definition and your definition, the most complex thing I could imagine, because I can't possibly imagine what the fuck you're talking about. It's all UFO made up mush.
And destructive interference patterns. These lines of force are a concept that came from...
Right, again, so he says they exist, yet they're constructive and destructive interference. No explanation of what's interfering with what, besides some conjugate magneto and counter space or something. Nothing to make this at all rational.
From Faraday in viewing iron filings above a magnet. The lines are due to constructive and destructive pressure.
So constructive and destructive pressure mediation. So that's his theory. And I gave you a really simple one. When the magnets are lined up, that is north side, north side, north side, north side, north side, facing one direction, all those little magnets are repulsive. And when their little magnets are put together in a group, they become a magnet. And each one of those lines of magnetism is repelling each other. So there's your simple, rational, material, easily understood explanation versus the whatever, the garbage, the gibberish he just spoke. Some magical interference thing.
Mediation between divergent and convergent force and counterforce factors that make up...
Divergent and convergent force and counterforce. So we have two different things there. Diverging, converging, force and counterforcing. And that explains something.
Up the magneto-dielectric conjugate geometry of, in this case, the permanent magnet.
So again, magneto-dielectric conjugate, all this gibberish. And people reward this. They think this is doing science. They think talking this gibberish has something to do with caring about the truth and finding the truth.
Namely, the reintegrating dielectric in the case...
The real reintegrating dielectric. Again, more stuff about stuff. There's no dielectric beyond the fact that you can have an insulator. Okay, that's essentially a dielectric in the sense that it will hold charge, but charge can't go through it.
To the hyperboloid, there are no lines, and force is qualified as the act...
So he says there's lines. He says they're created by interference, constructive and destructive interference. You heard him say it, and then he says there's no lines. I mean, I don't know how is this acceptable? Why is this acceptable to these people? You Ken Wheeler defenders. How is this acceptable? This is such an abuse of language, such a overt contradiction. There's no lines. He didn't even say lines of force. He just said there's no lines. And 2 minutes earlier, he's talking about how the lines are formed. How can this make sense to you?
Action of one thing upon another. The presumed magnetic lines are ether wake fronts.
So now the lines again, the presumed lines, they aren't presumed, they're observed in the sense that there's a reason why there's lines of magnetic material. And I've explained the reason. The secret. I mean, this is just so bad.
Both two-dimensionally circular and extrapolatively curvilinear.
So circular, curve, linear. So whatever that means. It's a circle, but it's just a loop. It's a curving this way. Or again, how can this make any sense? How is it acceptable for somebody to talk this way and get rewarded? This absolute gibberish.
To the mass around which they're circumambulating.
Circumambulating. Like they're in a wheelchair or something. Ambulating. You don't use the word like ambulating to describe something in physics. It's insane.
Or mediating out their own pressure.
Mediating out their own pressure. You don't say that either. That's like, prison guarding your own, walk to the bathroom. It just doesn't make any sense. These are not coherent sentences.
And interlacing between each other. These endless wake fronts are the genesis.
So this is the crap. He's actually going to read this shit. He's going to do an hour of gibberish to people who, who all might be tinfoil hatters, right? They all might be a little bit wacky. But I don't think any of them think you can just talk gibberish and call it science. So I don't think I don't think it's going to be well received. Even though they're tinfoil hat nutters, and even though this guy's a Tesla fan and all that crap, I think they're still going to say, Tesla didn't even talk that silly. What the hell was that crap?
Of magnitude, which begets the measure of same, so conceptualized as time.
So now conceptualized as time. So he threw time in here for absolutely no connected reason whatsoever. Good luck with that one.
Constructive and destructive phase due to space.
The constructive and destructive phase. So now we're doing things that have a frequency to have a phase, or a period. But no connection, no drawing, no illustration of where this phase interference thingy is happening at all.
Variance and or the displacement depending on the subject observed, be it light or the magnetodielectric interlace.
Be it light. So we're talking about magnetism. So he thinks magnetism does move light. He thinks things that there's absolutely no evidence ever happens, and he claims them to be facts when there's no evidence that it happens.
Of a palpable magnetic field of a magnet is the source.
So the palpable magnet, what is the word palpable doing in here? These are just mushy terms that have no meaning in science or physics, or they just don't. This has nothing to do with palpability. There's no palpable concept where like a magnet says, I don't like that idea. It gives me the creeps. There's no palpable.
Force of these presumed lines of force and or the lack thereof, where the valleys exist between the actual lines that we observe. Observance is one thing. Accurate explanations of what's going on is another.
And you don't do either one right. You observe poorly, and then you interpret bizarrely. And that's all you've done here. And you don't do it with even doing a little bit of research to understand that some of these questions actually have been answered by physics, and the evidence is significant.
Descriptions. People observe things and then they describe them, but descriptions are never explanations.
Certainly they can be. So again, just more cliches. Descriptions are never explanations. Bears have long claws. It's kind of an explanation why maybe you don't want to have lunch with a bear.
The absence of light or the assumed magnetism is destructive rather than loss of self-canceling in the dielectric, which terminates.
And so loss of self-canceling in the dielectric, which again, how can this jargon sell to anyone who understands that none of that crap has anything to do with physics? Physics is building, it's engineering. This is mush. You can't build anything with this mush.
It's, of course, in counter space. This interference is observed in the double slit experiment.
So again, he's comparing it to the double slit experiment, which is also misinterpreted by regular physics because there really isn't any interference. So again, it's just an on-off pattern. Every on-off pattern has to be called interference, even though that's not what it is. And clearly another circumstance where a nice, simple mechanical explanation would do just fine, just pointing out how the rays are bent. They are not, there is no constructive wave creation. There's no two waves interfering with each other from one photon, any of that crap. Clearly the photon goes in one way, comes out another way. Just like it deflects in a prism, just like it deflects in lots of things. Light can be deflected by hitting electrons. And that's what happens in the slit experiments. But again, to compare magnetism to the double slit is just erroneous. There's just absolutely no evidence that this has anything to do with any kind of interference, constructive or destructive.
In the exact same manner, however, contrary.
So he says, exact same manner. There's no sameness. There's no similarity at all. There's nothing even like it. The bars, the little magnetic lines are clearly don't line up in the same way in intensity or thickness or any of that stuff. There's no parallel at all.
To mathematicians, falsely paraded as scientists, by the way.
Yes, and you're falsely presiding as if you have some respect for intelligence, knowledge, the acquisition of facts, and something called evidence, which you clearly just couldn't care less about.
There are no waves of light, since, of course, waves are not a thing.
Yes, well, that's irrelevant and true. But it's not relevant to this subject, because there's no waves of magnetism for certain. That's really sure.
Nor is light a damn particle.
And magnets aren't a wavicle.
In the case of the double slit experiment, you don't even need a double slit. You only need a single eye, not the needle, which of course would be...
It actually won't give you the same pattern. The single needle will give you the same pattern as the single slit. It's two surfaces. Needle, two surfaces. The surfaces is all this is about. It's only surfaces.
Bifurcated double bar, but just a bar of a needle. And you could actually have the same constructive and destructive
See, it won't be the same because it won't fit inside the envelope of the single slit. It won't have the double slit pattern. It's the single slit pattern.
Interference pattern. So all of these things are not representing the lines. They're representing out the pressure mediations which exist in the magnetodielectric conjugate field.
The magnetodielectric conjugate field. Again, this is just jargon. How does anybody rational who's ever read what scientific book on planet Earth talks like that? That's religion or something. And it's not even good religion. Even the King James Bible doesn't even have gobbledygook in it. That frickin' bizarre.
We see lines. Well, look, I sprinkle the iron filings and I see lines. That's the magnetic lines of force. No, the magnetism is completely...
So let's understand. That's not what conventional physics is arguing. So it's a complete straw man argument. But anyway, enough, right? Yes, enough. Till the next time, again, if you have any knowledge of any web pages or websites that are accessible. I mean, I found a forum, but I couldn't access the forum. They had some sort of, you had to disconnect your browser ad block or some, I don't know, some kind of bullshit. And so anyway, if you have any links to any site that does a scientific examination of what ferrocells are producing, I would be interested. And thank you very much. Until next time and such.